Welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, an exploration of strategy, leadership, technology, and entrepreneurship. Your host, Nectar, is the co-founder and partner at the PNR, a strategy consulting firm based in Montreal.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, a show where we interview presidents, CEOs, and industry leaders to better understand how they think about strategy. On today's show, I spoke with Joe Meadows, co-founder and CEO at Opslock. First up, a quick thank you to Mark McLean that introduced me to Joe and spoke really highly of him, and Joe did not disappoint. Joe started his career as a mariner and quickly moved up the ranks to become chief mate at McDermott International, basically second in command of a very large ship. Joe has a very eclectic background. He saw an entrepreneurial opportunity to help prevent workplace incidents and then decided to launch his own startup. He co-founded Opslock, which builds tools to save lives at work. We spoke about on the show about how he became a master mariner, how he moved up the ranks, starting Opslock, and the interesting story of how he met his co-founder, the big opportunity that he saw for their product, and also raising funding from some of the world's top investors. Joe really seems to be on the verge of building a global business. He's truly passionate about his industry and shared some great insights, and I think that you'll enjoy today's episode. So, Joe, I guess a first question, an area I want to explore is your past life as mariner.
Yep.
So first, quick question. Have you had any accidents out at sea or witnessed any?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's somewhat of a touchy subject as it relates to, it's fairly easy to see who I've worked for in the past. So maybe instead of sharing a personal story, of which, frankly, I have many, I'll share something that I heard from actually another entrepreneur that I know in the maritime space. So although this might be surprising to many listeners, this particular company does a lot as far as process automation in the operations reporting of deep sea cargo companies. So frankly, an industry a part of the maritime industry that I wasn't a part of, but something that I was trained to do should the opportunity presented itself. And although they're not focused on safety, this tech company, the company they were talking to basically told them that they budget for about 8 fatalities per year. As far as in their books and the associated costs of workers' compensation and insurance and compensation for the families. So it's certainly something that's extremely prevalent. Some of the challenges that you hear about a lot in that industry are maybe, again, not intuitive to probably a lot of your listenership. So things like confined space entry, which is, basically doing work anywhere that's not designed for someone to inhabit, something like a big water tank that you might have to open up and get inside and clean. That's the most common location for fatalities in these environments. And the reason is that people will go in, and although it may seem fine and, you've pumped all the water out in those things, that the rust inside of these tanks actually pulls the oxygen out of the air. So that's a toxic environment. An employee will go inside, collapse. You might be standing outside of that hole and see your friend fall down and then enter the space to retrieve them. And there's been many documented cases of 4, 5, 10 employees in a pile in one of these spaces. And in many cases, those are fatal incidences. So things that we came in contact with fairly often. I was pretty close to not technically an employee of the company I was working for, but someone who lost the lower half of their leg getting run over by a forklift. Somebody who received a pretty debilitating mid-body injury that actually required that particular fellow to get repatriated to the Philippines where he was from, and he could no longer work at sea anymore. So long answer to your question. Short answer is yes. I have encountered some incidences in my career as a mariner.
Yeah, holy crap. I wasn't expecting that answer. It's kind of wild to think that obviously it's super sad, like these people getting hurt. And then B is like companies, how do we have to budget this in? Like, the CFO is sitting down, hey, we're going to have to plan for 8 fatalities this year. It's kind of macabre to think about it.
100%. And that's again, one of the things that, although it's an unsexy sort of industry-specific problem, the economic impact, and again, I think the emotional impact on these families, et cetera, is obviously much more substantial. But the economic impact in the U.S. alone, workplace injuries and fatalities, that's just maybe a market that we can all conceptualize a little easier, cost over $3 billion a week as far as their impact on the U.S. economy.
Wow. Wow. And how did you get into that industry? Was something at an early age you were thinking about, or?
Yeah. So the way I became a professional seafarer was actually I came by it honestly, as they would say. So my father was a captain of anchor handling ships in the North Sea when I was growing up. And I had never once thought that I would get into it. And then, to be totally honest, I had a girlfriend in high school who was going to school in Newfoundland. And I actually think my dad made an offhanded comment about how all the guys at that school were going to have a great time. She was a lovely girl. And I immediately, as a 17-year-old with a lot of testosterone in my veins, said, "What programs do they have over at that school?" And 3 weeks later, I was enrolled in a program to become a junior officer, and went through that at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and then from there ended up moving up through the ranks, and then ended up with my Master Mariner's license, which was the same one my dad had, and sort of something you could pat yourself on the back about a little bit.
It also seems like, and I don't know your industry at all,
sure,
but it seems like you moved up the ranks pretty quickly, more than average. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to pump my own tires too much, but...
Well, just a bit, more for the sake. So let's say, like, as agnostic as possible, right? You did kind of like climb the ranks much quicker than, let's say, your average mariner.
Yeah, I think I was... the way I've liked to conceptualize it is, yes, I was lucky enough to move up the ranks pretty quickly. I think partially that was attributable to the fact that I was pretty analytical, and I had a pretty clear idea of these are the companies I want to work for that are going to give me the skills that are going to allow me to sort of accelerate my career at a pretty rapid pace, because I found that very compelling, almost like the military or working in the sort of aeronautical industry. There's a very clear chain of command. So if you're an ambitious young guy, it's really easy to pop up. So yeah, I was pretty directly focused on that. And I think if I was to think of any skills I have that helped me do it, I think more than anything tangible. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm preternaturally good at coiling ropes, but I was pretty good at coming up with novel solutions to problems that probably weren't typical in that industry, and communicating them in a way that people were receptive to, because it is one of those industries where people are a little suspicious of who's this young guy trying to tell me how to do my job. And I think to a certain degree, I found a way to do that in a way that wasn't off-putting to the people around me.
Who's this young whippersnapper here?
Exactly. And I mean, to that point, when I was 25, I was the second in command of an asset worth over $200 million, and there was 200 people on board. And it was, a thing where I was often the youngest person there. And if the captain died, I was the guy. And that's, it brings things into perspective when you're 25 and having fun all over the world.
Yeah. Do you have a story of one of those novel solutions, something you could share? Or
I don't know if I have any specific examples, but I think just to your point, I was in many cases 10 or 20 years the junior of my colleagues at similar levels of responsibility in those organizations, and just having the ability to come in and, I've always been somebody who's been relatively tech enabled, and saying, what are the solutions we can implement here that are just going to make our days that much easier and allow us to address the more serious things at hand, and not just be paper pushers all the time.
Because you can imagine, like, if you go on to, one of these cargo vessels today, you don't know if it's like 2020 or if it's 1980, I imagine. Like, not much has changed, maybe outside of like navigation and like the tech running the boat, but everything else. Yeah,
no, I think even a lot of the tech running the boat, especially in the cargo world, is pretty old. I was lucky that in the type of service vessels that I was working on, they're in many ways sort of the bleeding edge of maritime technology. So, just for example, one of the systems that I was certified in was a positioning system that worked very similar to the way a lot of drones work today. So they use, differential positioning technology to keep, our boat was 11,280 tons, and we could keep it in place in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of, big weather, to an accuracy of about 10 centimeters. So some of that tech is really cool. But at the same time, when I started my career, no internet, a shared email address between everybody on board, on the bridge. You'd have to go up and, send an email to your family with the subject line being your name, and hope that whatever intimate response you received was not read by every single other person on board. So you end up very close with your colleagues working in an environment like that.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. One email for everyone. And you were at McDermott, which is a huge company.
Yep.
You were there for 4 years, and you moved up the ranks. Why decide to leave? Like, why decide to, it seemed probably like a safe job. You had studied in it.
Yeah. So I, McDermott, that happened to be the company that I had very specifically had ambitions of working for. And I was there, and I was really happy there. And I managed to make it through a few, mutations of their organization. And so I was feeling pretty good. I think I was probably next in line, if not second to next in line, when I left to being the next captain on one of their fleets when a spot was to come available. So yeah, I think valid question. I was making a lot of money. 6 months vacation a year is something that's funny to look back on now. But I think for me, the ability to sort of quickly move up through the ranks and be constantly experiencing new challenges and all those other things was what I loved about the job. And then I had reached a sort of plateau where you're then just waiting for people to die or retire. And you can get quite impatient. So, again, for me, and we'll get into this, but I saw this opportunity, and I just thought I couldn't wait. And I was lucky to be in a position where I had the risk tolerance to pursue something else.
Yeah. And when did you start getting that idea for Opslock? Was it, and when did it kind of like first fully form?
Yeah. So we, I don't know if it's still fully formed. I mean, if we're being honest with each other. That being said, I actually had an idea for my original sort of iteration for Opslock, maybe 2015, 2016. And I actually submitted a business plan proposal to Atlantic Business Magazine. I was living in Newfoundland at the time, and they had a business plan competition, and I was lucky enough to win. The problem was that as a professional boat driver, I did not exactly have the skills to build the app that I had in mind at the time. So I didn't go anywhere with it then. Did have a few ideas, and while I was still working as a mariner, I actually went on a coding boot camp in Bali. So one of the benefits of being a mariner, you do get a lot of vacation. I saw this boot camp advertised, I think, on Instagram, signed up for it about 15 minutes later. And it was actually at that boot camp where I met my co-founder, who was just coming out of another startup, was sort of burnt out, and decided to go to Bali and teach people how to code as a way to reevaluate his life. And little did he know he was going to bump into a tenacious mariner who was going to convince him to start a company over a few Indonesian beers.
That's pretty wild. That's a great story. Oh my God. So you guys are in Bali, you're trying to learn how to code. And then the professor is another young gentleman.
Yep.
That, we'll talk about his startup, but they decided, hey, you helped him convince him of the idea of Opslock.
Yeah, I think if he was here to defend himself, he would probably say that the idea that I originally pitched him was incredible, was quite simple, and he probably thought he could whip that together in a couple weeks. Turns out, it's become much more than that, and I think in many respects he was just happy to entertain me, and I don't know how serious he thought I was. And then over the sort of subsequent year or so, I was actually living in Portugal. I started flying him over to Portugal to really sort of get the ball rolling. And shortly after that, we ended up, I convinced him to leave his life and move to Austin, where we originally started the business. So,
and what's the basis? What's the simple idea behind Opslock?
Yeah. So I think in the simplest terms, or what the sort of genesis was for the idea, was that you have in almost all industrial environments, so by no means isolated to the maritime world, you have people spending huge amounts of time on health and safety paperwork. I'm sure if you called a mine in northern Quebec and said, what's the thing you hate the most about your job? It's that they have to sit down before their shift starts and fill out a bunch of checklists and other things like that. And what my idea was behind Opslock was, I'm sure there is a way to come up with a hardened solution that could turn this analog process digital. So that's sort of the fundamental idea, which everybody can understand. Let's stop wasting people's time, make this a little easier. What's a little bit different about us is that we're looking at it as a way to ultimately collect more data about the industrial workforce. So in many cases, these are the least digitalized industries in the world. And as much as we want to know more about them, it's very difficult to ask people to change their behavior, especially if it's just in service of collecting more data that may eventually be useful, maybe. But
isn't it an obligation? Like, you have to fill in those checklists, right?
So because you have to fill in those checklists, what we said is if we can build these digitally and also use them as a means by which to collect all this behavioral data, because a lot of it is we're able to capture either explicitly through what they share or contextually through the sensors on the device, that we could actually enable this huge sort of data-driven understanding of worker behavior, with the ultimate mission of being able to predict workplace accidents before they happen. So if you think about the 6,000 or so people a year in North America that die at work, our hope is that by providing a digital solution to this problem, like this cumbersome process people already dislike, if we can make that easier, and by doing so, collect this information that enables to identify the patterns that lead to everything from, maybe nicking your finger on a workbench to in the worst case, dying at work, that we would be able to predict those incidents before they happen by identifying these patterns of behavior and actually just sending a quick notification, for example, to a painter and say, because of XYZ factors, you seem like you're at a higher risk of getting hurt today. And although we're not going to tell you not to work, we would suggest you work on these other tasks that may be lower risk rather than, standing on top of the flagpole today.
Okay. So you're using machine learning to basically help predict higher incidences of accidents based on a bunch of variables, both implicit and explicit. The explicit ones make sense. What are the implicit ones?
They're almost all, many of them are explicit. I think a lot of what we're able to do is we've looked at it sort of like a pie, isn't in that, this health and safety paperwork is a pretty big piece of the pie. You also have a variety of other processes that are typically very poorly managed by these organizations. So some examples of those may be, training records, whether they be safety or professional training records, understanding how often and for what duration people are going to work, understanding people's competency assessments as it relates to their employers, and a variety of other things. And what we're able to do beyond, some things that are a little more nuanced, like tracking weather patterns and things like that play an impact on people getting hurt at work, that we're able to knit all of those previously siloed data sources, training records, hours worked, et cetera, and use all of those to get a more holistic understanding of the worker behavior, and give a more accurate prediction that a given employee's risk profile has become elevated.
Yeah. So this is 2 years ago, you guys decided, like, hey, we're going to incorporate, start this startup.
Yep.
How did you first go about it? Was it a daunting thing? You had, obviously, because you come from a very different world. So how did you initially tackle the challenge? Was it something today that you reflect on and say, oh, that was easy, or was it hard, or just curious to unpack it a bit?
I would say that we, more than anything, and I know luck is, people have very strong feelings about the word luck, but I think we ultimately feel very lucky. When we decided to get started, we had sort of, again, I was still living in Portugal at the time, and we just came to this realization that this was a big problem. There were a lot of things here, and although Brian, my co-founder, did have some startup experience, neither of us really knew how to build the company that I knew we could. So through actually a somewhat tenuous family connection, I reached out to my uncle, who's a pretty well-connected guy, and said, listen, we're trying to start this tech company. He has a pretty extensive network. I said, do you know anyone who might be able to have a 30-minute conversation with me and make sure I'm not going to hit the next pothole? And it took a little while, but he ended up connecting us with a gentleman by the name of John Seibold. And John was the founder of a very successful Silicon Valley startup. I thought we were going to have, like I said, a 30-minute conversation, and he was going to say, good luck out there, kid, and that was going to be the end of it. But he ended up developing a bit of an advisory relationship with us, was transformational in sort of how we thought about the business and what the business could be. And eventually he told us, you guys have got something here. You're going to have to quit your job and give this your all, or you're going to have to abandon it, because nobody builds successful tech companies as they're moonlighting. So it was sort of with that push out of the nest by somebody who was lucky enough to build a company worth today just over $9 billion. We thought he was worth listening to, and I left my job, and Brian left his job, and we moved to Texas and got started in Austin in May of 2018.
And today you're fully based in Montreal, is that correct?
That's correct. So we did an accelerator in Austin, sort of got up and running. Our logic was that many of our clientele, or probably the largest concentration in the world, is in Houston. Austin was sort of a tech center in close proximity, so we got started there. For a number of reasons, both for the arbitrage of it's extremely affordable to run a tech company in Montreal, and also because, I don't know if you're aware, but the current U.S. administration is not particularly receptive to immigrants. So there was a lot of uncertainty as it related to my status as a Canadian in having our company succeed in the U.S. We got to a point where we basically said, let's not even try. Let's relocate to Canada. And that's what brought us to Montreal just about a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And Houston makes sense because it's the oil and gas center, right, of the world. And you guys also announced a $2 million seed round from probably the biggest or most prestigious seed investor. So I'd love to unpack that and what you guys are planning to do with the capital. Like what's the plan basically? What's the go big or go home plan right now?
Yeah. So we're in this tremendous position to have a functioning product and paying customers, and we're out there. So we've de-risked a little bit, and we were super lucky to get some investment recently, led by Baseline Ventures in San Francisco. Most notably, first investor in Instagram, headed by Steve Anderson. And our objective for that capital is largely around execution, as well as obviously some additional development of our technology. So we're at a stage now where we have this amazing product. We're building a great team. We've already made some key hires in the past sort of 48 hours, which is pretty exciting. And we're growing now. We've kept things pretty lean. So our team, I think today, if I was to go to the office, there's 8 of us. I don't know when this will be released, but it's currently the 3rd week of January. By the end of February, we're expecting to be close to 20. And just growing super rapidly and trying to get out there and really execute. So as much as sometimes running a startup isn't what you see in the movies or on TV, that's certainly, since we've raised this money, it's starting to feel like all that sort of chaotic hyper growth that you see, and it's honestly really exciting.
Yeah. It's very cool. It's very cool. And is your investment going to be predominantly geared towards development or more in sales? Like, do you find that you have the product, it's time to kind of like pound the pavement and grow revenues? Or are you still trying to make adjustments to the product and improve it before you really make a more concerted go-to-market push?
I would say it's a bit of both. The majority of our funds are certainly going to development and the machine learning components and things like that. Like it doesn't come too easily. But we are at a point now where we do have something we're super confident in and people are using and enjoying. So we've brought in a go-to-market team from a couple super successful companies. I just hired a director of sales that's based, I don't know if I'll be coy about it, but a hyper-growth company based in Cambridge. in 2 years, they went from under $1 million to over $50 million in ARR. So a guy who's really been there for the sort of hyper growth, and we're really excited about what he'll be able to bring to the team. Hired a great marketing director based in Toronto, who's very shortly moving to Montreal. And basically every other dollar we can find in the bank account or in the couch or under the carpet is getting thrown at developers. Yeah. So that's nice. Where we are right now.
And what about business model? How do you guys charge?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a pretty simple, SaaS model. It's depends on the industry, but we're more and more moving towards just a per user per month sort of access model, paying for seats. From a customer's perspective, it allows them to essentially have a corporate health and safety system, which typically would be some small group of personnel. And the level of quality is sort of variable, where we're able to provide a world-class health and safety system for pennies on the dollar for those companies. And all they pay is for seats. And if their headcount goes down or goes up, the billing is just dynamic and it takes care of them that way. So it's pretty simple.
Do you see the opportunity for revenue expansion, like basically land and expand with those customers outside of just adding more seats?
Yeah, so we're looking at a number of things as far as revenue expansion. Some of it being how we offer those analytical tools, so the data products we're able to tack on top of the health and safety. We're still working on the pricing model as it relates to that. And then we're also looking at, if I circle back to that pie analogy, what are the other sort of functional areas where we can provide a lot of value and the systems are broken that would also allow us to get a better understanding of the contributing factors towards risk. So right now we're doing some research around actual maintenance planning projects. So you could not only have your health and safety system, but have your, if you've got some motors that you have to change the oil on once every 6 months, that all that will be managed in one place. We'd have a better idea of the risk associated with equipment maintenance and all those other things. So equipment maintenance, we're looking at some procurement products, again, all as a way for us to better understand aggregate risk that may not be explicitly physical, maybe financial risk. It may be, do weather patterns affect your purchasing patterns or things like that? Not that we expect to learn anything there, but we think that there's a tremendous opportunity here because when you look at a lot of the AI plays that are basically say, give me your fire hose of data and I'll tell you what it all means. The universal challenge is that data comes without context, and the biggest investment is in contextualizing all this information that they're receiving. So we're just trying to approach it as sort of, let's start with context and really well-structured contextualized data. And then the sort of machine learning piece is actually much simpler because it's not so much about sorting and typing data. It's just about identifying correlations between different patterns.
Yeah. It's crazy to think back. Like, as you're going back to my first question, your KPI is going to be how many lives you've saved, right? You're going to be able to track, here's the baseline. We had X number of accidents last year, X number of lives lost, unfortunately. And since you've implemented the system, here's the delta, right? So it's like, it's pretty wild. Like, you're going to be able to show this data at a certain point, imagine with a certain scale. Or am I like kind of like dreaming in technicolor and this is too far off?
No, that's I think exactly where we want to be. I mean, a lot of these organizations, especially mature organizations in North American markets, are lucky to be in the position where fatalities, for example, are not particularly common. But what we're trying to do is certainly identify those and mitigate their impact on these companies. But some of our, and to be honest, to circle back to revenue streams, many of our investors are very influential in the insurance space. And we think there's a tremendous opportunity as it relates to de-risking commercial insurance policies because we're able to provide data-driven solutions as it relates to the way commercial insurance is calculated, which anecdotally was explained to me that currently commercial insurance policies are sort of like licking your finger and putting it in the breeze. So the more we are able to provide our customers with data-driven reasoning as to risk diminishing on their work sites, that allows them to negotiate lower insurance rates, and everybody wins.
Yeah. So, what's your biggest challenge today as CEO? Like, what do you think it is?
There are many, but I think one of our biggest challenges is as we move more into this execution phase of the business, Frankly, I am one of our biggest bottlenecks in that I have owned many of our processes to date. And because we are I'll be the first to admit, in many ways, we are solving unsexy, industry-specific problems, empowering our go-to-market team with the type of industry context and the type of information that helps our customers know how empathetic we are with their challenges is just a huge amount of work. We've got clear plans in place, but getting enough sleep is maybe the more accurate answer to your question.
Yeah, we were saying before, like maybe trying to find a little bit of life balance in the sense of at least taking care of yourself from a health perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it sounds like you guys are crushing it right now. Have you started to think about other industries? I imagine you have a rollout plan. Right? What's the next natural extension?
Yeah, so I mean, to get into the weeds a little bit, we're actually working towards something a little closer to what you'd see in a traditional SaaS business, where companies of all sizes are able to just sign up for a free trial and use our tools and see the way that's able to impact their business. Allows us to capture maybe some of the smaller accounts that right now we're not approaching. It's purely elephant hunting for us right now. So that's part of our strategy, as is we are looking at expanding into things like the mining industry. Obviously, being here in Quebec, there's a lot of local accounts that we'd be able to talk to. Transportation, whether that be companies like CN or other organizations like that, where we may be able to have an impact on their KPIs and their injury rates. So it's a huge green field for us right now, and basically what we're focused on is surprising and delighting our customers with how much we can improve their workday, additionally make them safe. And, again, we're lucky to have a glut of opportunities in front of us, and we're just trying to choose the right ones.
Yeah, I imagine the classic kind of like, investor deck pitch slide of what's the market opportunity. I'd be curious to hear you on it.
Yeah, it's huge. So I think if we were to price out our available market on purely our health and safety products at our extremely reasonable prices. So to implement a health and safety system, let's say for example's sake, it costs $1 a day per employee to implement our system. You're looking at around $365 a year per employee. Many of these industries are spending in the area of $4,000 per employee per year on health and safety. So if you sort of look at those metrics, huge win for the business, big win for us. And then if you map that out in only North America and Australia, so Western markets that may be a little bit more receptive to technology like this, we're looking at $1 billion in annual revenue without factoring in the data products or the insurance products or other things like that. If we look globally at our available market, we're north of $20 billion annually. So
much more.
Yeah. So
what's the biggest objection you guys receive? Is it like, I imagine, is it just the status quo? Is it hard to beat the status quo, or are you customers very receptive and you have a high close rate once you're pitching?
We do have a really high close rate once we're pitching. I think in many cases our challenges are about the maturity of the organizations we approach. So there's sort of two customer profiles that we really go after. One being in industries like offshore oil and gas. These are places where health and safety culture has existed for a long time. There's huge regulatory burdens. And you hear about cases where, although somebody might work a 12-hour day, they only work 4 hours between all the paperwork they have to produce and all the mandatory breaks, et cetera. So in industries like that, what we're able to offer is extremely appealing just in its ability to reduce that bulk. So we would look at that as sort of an overbuilt customer. They're slow to turn, they're big accounts, but they're very receptive. And then the other customers we try to focus on are what we would view as underbuilt companies. So a company that may be, mid-size, verging on large, has gotten away with having almost no process-driven health and safety systems to this time. It's extremely appealing to them for us to just come in and pay us a fee, and tomorrow you can have a world-class health and safety system. So as it relates to sort of turning customers, we just try very hard to have the data and to approach the right customers and not try and turn some of these big behemoths who might be a little bit resistant to what we do. And all we're trying to do is expand the data we have, so that it eventually becomes a no-brainer. And we have enough customers, enough data to say, if you use this immediately, you're going to see, meaningful changes in the amount of risk that your organization is being exposed to. And that's going to affect your bottom line, which is ultimately what a lot of these people care about the most.
Yeah. It's tied to, it's all tied down to like a financial objective, but it seems like the way you're approaching it through the auspices of health and safety just makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Are there any sort of, maybe last technical question, but are there any certifications that you guys need to abide by? Like if you're like ISO, for instance, like to use a rather poor analogy, but.
Yeah. So there's actually, regulations, obviously on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. Some of the reports we're able to automatically produce. For example, in the US, it's a OSHA 300 or 300A or 301 form that you have to fill out as an employer if somebody hurts themselves. We have to have a certain amount of ownership of those different procedures in different locations. But in many cases, there's just best practices as it relates to health and safety. So because we were initially modeled off the offshore oil and gas model, which is where these systems are the most mature, I have yet to find an example where we don't greatly exceed the regulatory guidelines or requirements. So we're pretty lucky in that regard.
Yeah, Joe. I think I could probably talk about this for like another hour. It sounds so interesting what you guys are doing, and to be respectful for your time, maybe a final question. I'll let you go on your way. Where can people find more about what you guys are doing, hiring, etc.? Yeah.
So if you're here in Montreal, we're based on de Gaspé in the Mile End. Feel free to come by and say hi. As far as our specific address or any of the other details to get in touch with our team, it's just opslock.com. So ops as in operations, OPSLOCK.com. Feel free to look me up on LinkedIn, Joe Meadows. I think I'm the first one that comes up. And I'd be happy to connect with anybody locally or internationally or anything that'd be interested in learning more about what we're doing.
Yeah, great name, by the way. I forgot to mention.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for your time, Joe.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Point of No Return podcast. Don't miss an episode by subscribing on iTunes or Google Play.